Hello everyone and welcome to Spill Secret. Before we start, we ask you subscribe and leave a comment as to where you are listening from. Let's begin. The night sky above Pinegrove was an impenetrable shade of black, a curtain without stars, the thick cloud cover blotting out even the moon. Olivia Barker leaned against the rotting wooden bench on the station platform, clutching her jacket tight against the chill that seeped into her bones. Her breath hung in the air like mist, curling around her in small, ghostly clouds. She checked her watch. 9:55 p.m. The last train was scheduled for 10:10 p.m., but in this forgotten corner of the country, timetables were more like hopeful suggestions than actual plans. "Isn't anybody else waiting?" she muttered, casting a glance around the empty platform. The place looked abandoned, frozen in time, with yellowing posters from decades ago peeling off the walls and cobwebs gathering in the corners. The scent of mildew mixed with something faintly metallic, an odd tang that she couldn't quite place. She'd only meant to pass through Pinegrove on her way back home from her father's place, but the bus had broken down, forcing her to take this late train, a route she'd never traveled. Suddenly, the air shifted, prickling the hairs on the back of her neck. She wasn't alone anymore. She turned to find an elderly man, dressed in a dark overcoat, standing on the far end of the platform. He was hunched over slightly, his head hidden beneath the brim of a tattered fedora. He looked like he might be from another era, his clothes and mannerisms a stark contrast to the world she knew. Yet something about him was oddly familiar, as if she'd seen his face somewhere before. "You're waiting for the 10:10, I assume," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "That's the only train that comes by this late." "Yes," Olivia replied cautiously, unsure of his intentions. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here." The man chuckled, a sound that was more a dry rattle than a laugh. "Few people do," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Name's Eli. Been waiting here for years. Seems like." He paused, studying her with eyes that glinted strangely under the dim platform light. "They say it's the last train out of Pinegrove, but folks never come back to tell if it's true." Olivia shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the man's words. She gave a polite smile, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling that was starting to gnaw at her. "Well, I'll be sure to let them know back home that I made it safe." Eli's expression darkened. "Home? You sure you got one waiting for you?" His question hung in the air like a challenge, piercing through her thin smile. Olivia opened her mouth to reply, but a distant, mournful sound echoed down the tracks. It was the whistle of a train, a long, sorrowful note that seemed to vibrate in her chest. She turned to the tracks, her heart pounding. The train's headlights pierced the night, growing brighter as it approached. The train pulled into the station with a screech that reverberated through Olivia's bones. Its cars, coated in grime and age, looked as if they'd been plucked from a forgotten decade. Faded paint peeled from their sides, and the windows were thick with dust, concealing whatever, or whoever, might be inside. As the doors creaked open, a thick mist spilled out, curling around Olivia's ankles like ghostly fingers. Eli gave her a slight nod. "Go on, then. Best not to keep them waiting," he said, his voice low. There was something in his gaze, a hint of sadness mingled with a warning that made her hesitate. But the biting cold and her exhaustion drove her forward. She clutched her bag and stepped onto the train, her boots echoing dully on the ancient metal floor. Behind her, the doors hissed shut, sealing her inside with a finality that made her heart skip. Inside, the train was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering as though they, too, were on their last leg. Rows of seats stretched out before her, each one covered in a layer of dust, save for a handful that looked freshly used. She spotted a few figures, scattered throughout the car, each sitting unnaturally still, their faces obscured by the shadows. Olivia's pulse quickened as she scanned their silhouettes, each one appearing more like a statue than a person. She took a seat near the back, away from the others, her eyes darting to the nearest passenger. It was a woman with long, stringy hair, her head tilted down as if in deep thought, or maybe she was asleep. But something felt off. Olivia couldn't quite place it, but she sensed a strange energy from the other passengers, like they were somehow removed. As the train jerked forward, a conductor appeared from the far end of the car. He wore an old-fashioned uniform, the kind Olivia had only seen in black and white photos. His face was hidden beneath a low-brimmed cap, and he moved with a slow, almost mechanical precision. When he reached her, he extended a gloved hand. "Ticket," he said, his voice void of warmth. Olivia fumbled in her bag, pulling out the paper stub she'd been issued at the ticket counter in Pinegrove. As he took it, she noticed the oddest thing: the conductor's hands were cold, deathly so, like they'd been submerged in ice water. His grip tightened for just a moment, his gaze meeting hers, and for the briefest of seconds, she saw a flicker of something, emptiness, in his eyes. He returned the ticket and continued down the aisle without another word. Once he disappeared, Olivia let out a shaky breath, her pulse racing. She leaned her head back, willing herself to relax, but the silence around her was suffocating. It felt as though the entire train was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. As she stared out the window, she realized with a start that she couldn't see anything outside, only darkness, endless and consuming. Just as she was beginning to question if she'd made the right choice boarding this train, a soft voice broke the silence. "They don't usually let new passengers on, you know." Olivia turned to see a man sitting across the aisle. He had a gaunt, hollow face, his skin pale as bone and his eyes sunken deep. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet there was a strange intensity in his gaze. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice unsteady. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This train. It's not like any other. People who get on here. They're usually looking for something, trying to escape something. Are you running from something, miss?" Olivia shook her head, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "No, I'm just trying to get home." The man's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. "Home," he repeated, as if the word itself held a bitter irony. "Just remember, not everyone who gets on this train ever gets off." The train rumbled on, each second stretching into eternity as Olivia felt the creeping realization that she might not be on an ordinary ride home. As the train rattled onward, Olivia couldn't shake the man's ominous words. The idea of people never getting off this train gnawed at her. She glanced around, trying to catch the eyes of the other passengers, hoping for some silent reassurance. But each person sat motionless, staring ahead, their faces veiled in shadows. It was as if they were frozen in place, existing in some dreamlike limbo. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was all in her head. But just then, the train lights dimmed, flickering erratically as the car was swallowed by an even deeper darkness. Olivia's heart hammered in her chest, each pulse louder than the one before. The only sound was the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels on the tracks, an eerie reminder of their relentless journey into nowhere. Then, she noticed something odd. The scenery outside began to change, or so it seemed. Faint, ghostly shapes flickered past the windows, trees, perhaps, or maybe dilapidated buildings. They were barely there, like the remnants of some forgotten world flashing in and out of existence. Just as she leaned closer to get a better look, the door at the far end of the car swung open, and Eli, the man from the platform, stepped inside. "Eli." Olivia whispered, half expecting him to dissolve like a mirage. But he moved closer, his gaze fixed on her, his expression unreadable. He looked almost transparent under the dim lights, his features thin and grey as though he were part of the mist that had entered with him. "Still on board, are we?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "They let you on, but did they tell you how to get off?" Olivia's mouth went dry. "What are you talking about? This is just a train ride. I'm going home." Eli shook his head slowly, his gaze filled with a sadness that cut through her defenses. "Home," he murmured, as if the word was foreign to him. "This train doesn't go where you think it does. It takes people to places they're meant to face, to places they can't avoid." She felt a tremor run through her as Eli leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you remember what happened before you came here? Why you really boarded this train?" Olivia opened her mouth, ready to snap back with something rational, but the words caught in her throat. Her mind reeled, grasping at memories that suddenly felt distant, obscured. She remembered the bus breaking down, sure. She remembered the strange atmosphere of the station. But beyond that, everything grew hazy, like an unfinished painting, details she couldn't quite recall. The train lurched again, its lights blinking out for a long moment before flickering back on. In the brief blackout, she felt something, a presence closer than before. And when the lights returned, the other passengers had shifted, all of them now facing her direction, their eyes glinting in the dim light. "Tell me, Olivia," Eli's voice cut through her rising panic. "What are you running from?" Her mind spun, searching for an answer, a memory, something to ground herself in reality. "I'm not running from anything," she said, more to herself than to Eli. But even as she spoke, a feeling of dread curled in her chest. Images started to flash through her mind, of her father's house, of tense arguments, of the regret she'd tried so hard to ignore. Was that why she was here? Had she come to escape those unresolved pieces of her life? The man who'd warned her earlier now leaned into the aisle, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "Once you get on, there's no running? This train, it finds you wherever you go. Whatever you've left undone, it brings you back to face it." Olivia's hands began to tremble as Eli gave a small nod, almost as if he were confirming the man's words. "Remember, Olivia, we're all on here for a reason." The train plunged into a tunnel, the darkness outside swallowing even the faint shapes she'd seen before. Her heart pounded as she stared into the void, realizing that she might not be going home at all. This was a journey into something much deeper, much darker than she had ever imagined. The train rattled and shook as it barreled through the endless darkness, the noise of the wheels blending into a droning hum that filled Olivia's head. Every face in the car turned toward her, their eyes hollow, watching as though they were waiting for something. Eli remained nearby, his face unreadable, and the man with the gaunt face leaned back in his seat, almost as if he knew she'd soon understand what he meant. A memory suddenly surfaced, hitting Olivia like a punch to the gut. She was back in her father's house, his face twisted in anger, his voice rising as he shouted. They'd fought over her leaving, over her decision to distance herself from everything that reminded her of her mother's death. She'd run from it all, from the weight of grief and guilt, desperate to escape the pain that seemed to haunt every corner of that house. The scene in her mind blurred, and she was back on the train, her hands gripping the seat tightly as if it would steady her. Eli watched her carefully, his eyes softened by an understanding that chilled her. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" he asked quietly. "Running away doesn't mean leaving things behind. Sometimes, it just brings them with you." Olivia clenched her jaw, her heart pounding. "What are you saying? I didn't do anything wrong." I just needed to get away. Eli's face was almost sorrowful. Some things can't be escaped, Olivia. They follow, like shadows. His voice dropped, taking on a weight that made her feel small and vulnerable. This train. It doesn't just take you anywhere. It takes you to confront what you left unfinished. It's a place between places, a journey that forces you to look at the things you'd rather forget. The other passengers continued to watch her, their faces twisted with expressions that were impossible to read. Olivia felt a crushing weight settle over her, an intense regret that she'd buried deep down, surfacing now like an unwelcome ghost. She looked out the window, but there was still nothing, only darkness, like a void stretching endlessly. Then, the train began to slow, the wheels grinding against the tracks as they screeched in protest. Through the windows, Olivia saw faint shapes coming into view, barely their glimpses of her father's house, her own apartment, the roads she used to take. Each image was half-formed, like shadows of her life brought to life in the mist. The conductor reappeared, his eyes settling on her with a knowing gaze. "This is your stop, Miss Barker," he announced, his voice resonating with finality. "But only if you're ready to face what you left behind." She swallowed hard, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her bag, standing on unsteady legs. The images outside the window flickered, each one more vivid than the last: her father's disappointed face, the emptiness of her mother's old room, the quiet ache of loss that had driven her to flee. As the train came to a halt, she turned to Eli, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens if I get off?" Eli looked at her with a sadness that mirrored her own. "Then you go back, and you face the things you couldn't before. You'll find peace, one way or another. But staying on, that's a different path. It's a journey that never ends, a choice to run forever." Olivia's heart pounded as she stood at the door, looking out at the ghostly scene of her memories. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her regrets and fears press against her chest. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, knowing this was her last chance to turn back, to choose a different path. With one final glance at Eli and the other passengers, she stepped off the train, feeling the chill of the night settle around her. The platform was empty, the mist clinging to her like a second skin as the train pulled away, vanishing into the darkness as though it had never been there. She watched until it was gone, a strange sense of calm washing over her. She had no idea what awaited her, but she knew one thing: she would no longer be running. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Olivia turned away from the tracks, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Eleanor hadn't been back to Miller's Pond in nearly 20 years, not since that summer she and her friends had vowed to never speak of again. But when her younger brother Michael disappeared last autumn, the same night he told her he'd been back to the pond, something inside her snapped. As she walked the winding, familiar trail through the thick, leafless trees, she felt the weight of years fall away, replaced by an eerie, chilling sense of déjà vu. The pond's quiet allure was as unsettling as it had always been, its surface dark and glass-like, mirroring the thick grey clouds that blocked out the afternoon sun. Her fingers traced the scars along her right forearm, a roadmap of her memories from that summer. The scars had long since healed, but the memory of that night, the echo that followed them all home, never did. Her therapist had always said she needed closure, that facing her fears could help her make peace with whatever happened out there. But Eleanor knew that her therapist was wrong. Some memories didn't want to stay buried, and the ones that did should be left that way. "Ellie," a voice whispered, faint yet familiar, carried by the breeze rustling through the dry autumn leaves. She turned sharply, her breath hitching, only to find the path empty behind her. Her heart hammered against her ribcage, each beat a reminder that she was alone, or so she hoped. She'd forgotten how unsettling the silence was here, the way every sound seemed to linger, to echo in a way that defied logic. Michael had always been the curious one, the risk-taker. After she left, he spent his teenage years exploring the woods, searching for answers to questions no one dared ask. He'd call her late at night, whispering about the strange sounds he'd heard near the pond, about the shadows that moved on their own. And each time, she'd beg him to stop, to leave it all alone. But curiosity was a powerful thing, especially when it mixed with fear and defiance. Now, standing on the edge of the pond, she wished she'd done more to convince him. "Why did you come back here, Michael?" she muttered, scanning the dark waters, half expecting him to emerge from the trees, laughing at her for believing in ghosts. But the pond was empty, the only sound her own voice slipping away into the chilling silence. Still, something didn't feel right. She could feel eyes on her, a prickling at the back of her neck that only grew stronger with every passing second. As the minutes ticked by, she began to feel different, like a stranger in her own skin. The longer she stood there, the more her memories twisted and blurred. She could hear faint laughter, memories of her teenage friends ringing through the clearing as if they were still here, hiding in the trees, watching her. "Ellie, don't look back." They'd teased her then, dared her to dive into the pond's icy depths. But she remembered the fear in their eyes, the way they all ran when the whispers started. A faint splash echoed across the water, and Eleanor jumped, her heart lodging in her throat. She scanned the pond again, searching for signs of movement, but the water was still. It was like something was out there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for her. Her stomach twisted as she took a hesitant step back, the memory of that long-ago night rising to the forefront of her mind with brutal clarity. "Michael." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence. In that moment, she knew she was not alone. The echo, the haunting, chilling echo of that night, was back. And this time, it felt stronger, more powerful, as if it had been waiting for her all these years, growing in her absence. The whispers returned, soft and relentless, pressing against her mind like a long-lost lover's hand, urging her to stay. Eleanor's legs felt rooted to the ground, as though the earth had claimed her as its own. Her thoughts churned, slipping between past and present, as if the pond itself was pulling her into its depths without her needing to step forward. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms until the pain cleared her mind, if only for a moment. She was here for Michael, she reminded herself. Whatever happened all those years ago didn't matter anymore, she just needed to find him. Just as she steeled herself, a faint, rhythmic sound broke the silence. It was almost like footsteps. She turned, scanning the forest behind her, but nothing stirred. "Michael." Her voice quivered, a hollow sound swallowed by the endless woods. The footsteps grew louder, echoing around her as if someone, or something, was pacing just out of sight, circling her. She felt the hairs on her arms stand up as an icy chill crept along her spine. But the only answer was silence, thick and unyielding, suffocating in its intensity. And then, from the shadows a figure emerged. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she took an instinctive step back, her breath catching. At first, she thought it was Michael, tall and lean like he'd always been, his shoulders slouched as if carrying the weight of secrets. But as he stepped closer, her stomach dropped. His eyes were vacant, glassy, staring through her rather than at her. His lips moved, but no sound escaped, only a faint, raspy wheeze that seemed more an echo than a voice. "Ellie." The voice finally came, soft and strained, barely more than a whisper. But it wasn't Michael. No, this voice was older, tinged with a sorrow that made her heart ache with a familiarity she couldn't quite place. She took a shuddering breath, willing herself to stand her ground. "Who are you?" she demanded, forcing strength into her voice, though her heart thundered with each beat. The figure tilted its head, as if pondering her question. "Don't you remember?" it murmured, voice slipping into her mind like a forgotten memory. "You came here once, you all did. But you didn't keep your promise, did you?" Its voice turned colder, edged with something darker, more menacing, as if dredging up years of resentment. Eleanor's mind spun, memories of that summer resurfacing with brutal clarity, images of her friends' faces, their laughter, their fear, the whispered oaths they'd made and broken. "We were just kids," she whispered, her voice trembling as the truth of that night surfaced, raw and unfiltered. "They'd promised to forget, to pretend it never happened, but promises like that don't die easily." And now, standing here, she felt the weight of that broken vow pressing down on her. She remembered the figure, the strange man who had emerged from the trees, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, speaking in riddles, warning them of the pond's curse. "What do you want?" she asked, feeling a knot of dread coil in her stomach as the figure took another step toward her. His face was clearer now, the ghost of Michael's features twisted into something unrecognizable, yet familiar, as though some part of her had always known this shadow. "What we all want, Eleanor," he said softly. "A way out?" She took a step back, her gaze darting toward the path, the trees that seemed to close in around her, trapping her. The figure followed her every move, its eyes dark, endless, like the pond behind her. The whispers grew louder, weaving around her thoughts, pulling her back to that summer night, to the cold water, to the pact they had made in desperation. "You were supposed to free us," the figure said, its voice a harsh whisper. "But instead, you left us here?" Panic clawed at her, rising like bile in her throat. "I don't understand," she cried, her voice breaking as the figure's face twisted in anger, a deep sorrow etched into every line. "You will," it replied, a note of finality in its tone, as though sealing her fate. "You will understand everything, Eleanor. Soon?" As the words faded, the figure dissipated like mist, leaving Eleanor alone once more, the silence thicker, darker than before. She stood there, heart racing, her mind buzzing with fragments of memories and unspoken truths, a growing certainty that whatever happened that night wasn't over. It had only just begun. The path back to the car seemed longer, darker, as Eleanor forced herself to turn away from the pond. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave Miller's Pond and never look back. But her mind was plagued by more questions than answers. Who were those voices, the shadows of her past come to haunt her? And what had really happened that night when she and her friends had vowed to forget? As she walked, memories flooded her with each step, flashes of laughter and fear, the feeling of icy water against her skin, and the figure who had whispered to them from the shadows. She could almost hear her friends' voices, their terrified giggles as they dared each other to jump, to dive into the darkness of the pond. She remembered how it had felt, cold and relentless, the silence broken only by their breaths and whispers. And then the figure, the man with the hood who had emerged from nowhere, warning them of the echo that waited beneath the surface, trapped and angry. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to the present. She fumbled with it, her hands trembling as she read the message. It was from her old friend Lucy, one of the few people she'd stayed in touch with from those days. The message was simple, almost cryptic, but it made Eleanor's blood run cold. "It's happening again, isn't it?" She called Lucy immediately, her heart pounding as she listened to the ringing on the other end. "Eleanor." Lucy's voice was shaky, tinged with fear that mirrored Eleanor's own. I thought I was imagining things, but I saw him, Ellie. The man from the pond. He's back. He's watching me." Eleanor's mouth went dry, her hands tightening around the phone. "Lucy, I saw him too. He looked like Michael." Her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. I think he's angry with us. We broke our promise, Lucy. We left him there?" Lucy's voice quivered on the other end. "Do you think he blames us? For what happened that night? For everything that went wrong?" The guilt that laced her words was thick, a weight they both carried, buried deep but never truly forgotten. They had been foolish, curious, and reckless, drawn to the pond's mystery like moths to a flame. And now, it seemed, the flame had reignited, ready to consume them all. A sudden crack of a branch echoed from the woods beside her, and Eleanor turned, her heart leaping into her throat. "Lucy, I have to go," she whispered, ending the call as she shoved her phone into her pocket. She felt watched, exposed, as though the very trees were closing in around her. Every shadow seemed to breathe, to shift, whispering her name in voices that sounded eerily like her friends. She couldn't shake the feeling that the pond was alive, that it was drawing her back to finish what she'd left undone. The path veered to the right, leading her in a slow arc back to the water's edge. As she approached, her legs felt heavier, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. There, near the bank, was something she hadn't noticed before, a small, weathered journal, half buried in the dirt. She crouched down, brushing off the dirt as she opened it, her breath catching as she read the familiar handwriting. It was Michael's. The first few pages were innocent enough, lists of plants, sketches of wildlife, notes about the changing seasons. But as she flipped further, his writing grew frantic, the ink smeared and hurried. His last entry was scrawled in bold, shaky letters, a final warning: they're not gone. The echo lives. It wants us back. Eleanor's mind reeled as she clutched the journal to her chest, her eyes drifting toward the pond. Michael had known, somehow, that this day would come. He had felt it, the pull of the pond's curse, the anger festering beneath its surface. And now, as she stared into the dark water, she could feel it too, a presence growing stronger, reaching out to her like a hand from the grave. With trembling fingers, she closed the journal, her mind buzzing with Michael's words. The echo lives. It wants us back. And in that moment, she understood that leaving was no longer an option. Whatever was here, whatever haunted the pond, would not rest until she faced it. Until she remembered everything. The air around Miller's Pond grew colder as dusk descended, a thick fog rolling in over the water's surface, swallowing the trees and casting everything in an eerie, ghostly light. Eleanor clutched Michael's journal tightly, her fingers numb but her mind clear for the first time in years. She'd come back to find him, to confront whatever dark force had taken him. And now, she was ready to face it. The whispers started again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent, like the hum of a swarm circling her. Shadows stretched across the pond, twisting and writhing as if alive. She took a tentative step forward, feeling an invisible force pulling her closer, her every instinct screaming to run but her feet refusing to move. She had to finish this. For Michael. For herself. For all of them. "Ellie." The voice echoed from the mist, deep and resonant, the same voice that had haunted her dreams for years. She strained her eyes, peering through the fog, and there he was, Michael, standing at the edge of the water, his form hazy, like a mirage. Her heart ached at the sight of him, the familiar curve of his shoulders, his hair falling messily across his forehead. But his eyes. They were different, dark and hollow, devoid of the warmth she remembered. "Michael!" she cried, her voice breaking as she reached for him. He didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, his gaze fixed on her with a vacant intensity. "You left me, Ellie, he said finally, his voice a twisted version of his own, layered with something older, something sinister. You left us all here. Tears filled her eyes as she took another step, desperate to reach him, to explain, to tell him how sorry she was. I didn't know. I was scared, Michael. We were just kids. Her words faltered as he raised a hand, silencing her, his expression unreadable. Behind him, shadows began to emerge from the fog, her old friends, one by one, their faces twisted in sorrow, their eyes accusing. Lucy, Tom, Jenna, they stood like specters, bound to the pond, trapped in the memory of that long-ago night. We all came back, Ellie, Michael continued, his tone laced with bitterness. But you never did. You left us to face the echo alone. The shadows around him murmured in agreement, their voices a chorus of anger and despair. Eleanor felt her heart shatter, guilt washing over her in waves. She remembered the fear she'd felt that night, the way she had bolted from the pond, her only thought to escape, to leave it all behind. But she hadn't realized the others had stayed, that they had been trapped here, caught in the echo's grasp. She dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached out, her voice a broken whisper. I'm so sorry, Michael. I didn't know. Tell me how to make it right. Please. Her plea hung in the air, her heart pounding as she waited for him to respond. For a moment, there was only silence, the shadows watching her with hollow eyes. And then, slowly, Michael extended his hand, a faint glimmer of warmth returning to his gaze. Come with us, Ellie, he whispered, his voice soft, almost gentle. Join us? It's the only way to make it right. She stared at his hand, her mind racing, torn between the longing to be with him again and the terror of what that would mean. She could feel the pond's pull, a dark, magnetic force urging her to let go, to slip beneath the surface and join the echo forever. But as she looked into Michael's eyes, something shifted within her. She remembered the promise she had made, to live, to escape, to carry their memories forward. She couldn't let the pond consume her, couldn't let it claim another life. With a trembling breath, she rose to her feet, her gaze steady, her voice firm. No, Michael. I won't stay. I'll remember you, all of you. But I won't let this place keep me. Not anymore. The shadows wavered, their forms flickering like candlelight as Michael's expression twisted in anguish. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, he looked like the brother she remembered, his eyes full of regret. And then, with a final, haunting whisper, he and the others faded into the fog, their forms dissolving, leaving Eleanor alone by the pond. The fog lifted, the shadows dissipating as dawn broke over the horizon. Eleanor took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of years lift from her shoulders, her heart finally at peace. She knew the echo would remain, that the pond would continue its haunting call. But she had made her choice. She had faced her past, and now, she was free. The town of Stillwater was a place most folks forgot, a smudge on the map in the midst of dense forests and forgotten trails. Even the sun seemed to cast a shadow on the town longer than it did anywhere else, as if the place bore a darkness it could never quite shake. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been one unspoken rule among the locals: never cross Stillwater Bridge after midnight. Most people followed this rule without question, but for Patrick, a man whose curiosity had often led him into dangerous places, the bridge had become an obsession. He was a writer with a stubborn need to dig into mysteries that didn't want to be solved. Ever since he'd moved to Stillwater, he'd heard whispers about the bridge. The local lore was rich, laden with stories of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and the occasional disappearance. But what really piqued his interest were the rumors of people who had crossed the bridge at night and returned with no memory of what had happened. "Why don't you just let it go, Patrick?" his girlfriend, Marla, asked one rainy evening as they sat in his dimly lit living room. "I mean, there's a reason people avoid that bridge. Some things are just better left alone." Her voice held an edge of fear, a tension he'd rarely heard from her before. She wasn't usually one to believe in ghost stories, but Stillwater seemed to change people. Patrick leaned back, his eyes flashing with that familiar spark of intrigue. "You don't get it, Marla. The bridge, there's something about it. Something, calling to me. Don't you ever wonder why nobody talks about what really happens out there?" Marla shook her head, crossing her arms tightly as if to shield herself from whatever thoughts the bridge conjured. "What if it's not a good kind of calling? Some of those people, they didn't come back the same, Patrick. The ones that came back at all, I mean." He let her words hang in the air, feeling the chill they left in their wake. Marla wasn't wrong. He'd read enough accounts of those who had returned from the bridge, hollow, distant people who spoke in low voices and seemed to carry the shadows with them. Some of them refused to speak of what they'd seen. Others simply couldn't remember anything at all. But his curiosity was relentless. That night, he lay awake in bed, the rain drumming against the window as his thoughts spiraled around the bridge. There was a mystery to be unraveled there, he was certain of it. The idea that the bridge held some dark secret was too enticing to ignore, and no amount of warning could change that. At exactly 11:59 p.m., Patrick found himself standing at the edge of Stillwater Bridge, the mist from the river swirling around his feet. The air was heavy, carrying a strange silence that seemed to press down on him, as though the world held its breath in anticipation. The bridge stretched before him, its wooden planks creaking under the weight of his steps as he walked forward. As he crossed the halfway point, he noticed something odd. The mist was thickening, wrapping around him like tendrils reaching out from the darkness. A shiver ran down his spine. He could hear something faint, almost like a whisper, though it was too distant to make out the words. The bridge seemed to stretch endlessly, the other side hidden in a thick veil of fog. Patrick stopped, straining to listen, and that's when he felt it, a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. Just the mist, clinging to his clothes like cold breath. He shook his head, trying to dispel the unease. "It's just my imagination," he muttered to himself, though even he didn't believe it. He could have sworn he heard laughter, faint and distant, as if someone, or something, was watching him, mocking him for daring to cross. But Patrick was determined to push forward. He continued, each step louder, more forceful, hoping to drown out the whispers that seemed to grow louder with every footfall. Then, without warning, a figure appeared at the far end of the bridge. A woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face obscured by the fog. "Hello," Patrick called out, his voice echoing in the dense silence. The woman didn't move, just stood there, staring at him with eyes that seemed to pierce the mist. A sudden gust of wind cut through him, and he felt that cold touch on his shoulder again, stronger this time. He tried to take another step, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure at the end of the bridge raised her arm, pointing at him, and though her lips never moved, he could hear her voice as clear as a bell in his mind. "You shouldn't be here, Patrick. Not tonight?" That looked as though it belonged to another era, torn and stained with mud. The longer he stared, the more he realized her gaze wasn't directed at him, but through him, as if he were merely a shadow, a passing figure in a nightmare she couldn't escape. "Why are you here?" he whispered, more to himself than to her, though part of him hoped for an answer. He took a step forward, feeling the wooden planks creak underfoot. His voice sounded strange in the dense silence, swallowed up almost as soon as it left his lips. The woman tilted her head, her empty stare shifting slightly, locking onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her mouth opened, and a low, rasping voice filled his mind, though her lips barely moved. Lost. We are all lost. But you. You still have a choice. A choice. The words puzzled him, twisting his fear into a sick curiosity. He took another step, this time feeling the weight of her words sink into him. It was as though the bridge was a threshold, a liminal space between life and death, reality and nightmare. What choice? He asked, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. She didn't answer, but instead, her eyes seemed to grow darker, hollowing out until they were nothing but black pits. The fog around him began to churn, spiraling into strange shapes, faces and hands reaching out, fading before he could fully register them. In the distance, he heard the faintest echo of laughter, a sound that sent a sharp pang of dread through his chest. As if compelled, he continued walking toward her, unable to stop his feet. Marla was right, he muttered under his breath, a bitter taste filling his mouth. The bridge had a power of its own, a dark pull that seemed to strip away his will with every step. The woman remained motionless, her expression vacant yet strangely mournful, as though she were witnessing a tragedy that she was helpless to prevent. "Please," he whispered, almost to himself, desperation cracking his voice. "I don't understand. What do you mean, a choice?" She lifted her hand, her long, thin fingers beckoning him forward. He didn't want to follow, but the bridge seemed to dissolve behind him, leaving him no path but forward. His heart thudded in his chest, his breaths coming faster as he drew nearer to her. When he was just a few feet away, she dropped her hand and looked straight into his eyes, her voice filling his mind once again. "Go back while you can. The others. They are already lost. But you still have time? If you turn back now." He swallowed, a chill racing down his spine. Her words filled him with a strange relief, a glimmer of hope. But as he looked into her hollow eyes, he knew he couldn't turn back, not now. There was something he needed to understand, something that called to him with a force he couldn't ignore. "I have to know," he whispered, almost apologetically. "I have to know what's out here. What's happened to you? To everyone else." Her face twisted in an expression of sorrow, and for a brief moment, Patrick thought he saw a flicker of warmth in her gaze, something human. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by an emptiness that seemed to swallow all light. That looked as though it belonged to another era, torn and stained with mud. The longer he stared, the more he realized her gaze wasn't directed at him, but through him, as if he were merely a shadow, a passing figure in a nightmare she couldn't escape. "Why are you here?" he whispered, more to himself than to her, though part of him hoped for an answer. He took a step forward, feeling the wooden planks creak underfoot. His voice sounded strange in the dense silence, swallowed up almost as soon as it left his lips. The woman tilted her head, her empty stare shifting slightly, locking onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her mouth opened, and a low, rasping voice filled his mind, though her lips barely moved. "Lost. We are all lost. But you. You still have a choice." A choice. The words puzzled him, twisting his fear into a sick curiosity. He took another step, this time feeling the weight of her words sink into him. It was as though the bridge was a threshold, a liminal space between life and death, reality and nightmare. "What choice?" he asked, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. She didn't answer, but instead, her eyes seemed to grow darker, hollowing out until they were nothing but black pits. The fog around him began to churn, spiraling into strange shapes, faces and hands reaching out, fading before he could fully register them. In the distance, he heard the faintest echo of laughter, a sound that sent a sharp pang of dread through his chest. As if compelled, he continued walking toward her, unable to stop his feet. Marla was right, he muttered under his breath, a bitter taste filling his mouth. The bridge had a power of its own, a dark pull that seemed to strip away his will with every step. The woman remained motionless, her expression vacant yet strangely mournful, as though she were witnessing a tragedy that she was helpless to prevent. "Please," he whispered, almost to himself, desperation cracking his voice. "I don't understand. What do you mean, a choice?" She lifted her hand, her long, thin fingers beckoning him forward. He didn't want to follow, but the bridge seemed to dissolve behind him, leaving him no path but forward. His heart thudded in his chest, his breaths coming faster as he drew nearer to her. When he was just a few feet away, she dropped her hand and looked straight into his eyes, her voice filling his mind once again. "Go back while you can. The others. They are already lost. But you still have time? If you turn back now." He swallowed, a chill racing down his spine. Her words filled him with a strange relief, a glimmer of hope. But as he looked into her hollow eyes, he knew he couldn't turn back, not now. There was something he needed to understand, something that called to him with a force he couldn't ignore. "I have to know," he whispered, almost apologetically. "I have to know what's out here. What's happened to you? To everyone else." Her face twisted in an expression of sorrow, and for a brief moment, Patrick thought he saw a flicker of warmth in her gaze, something human. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by an emptiness that seemed to swallow all light.
"Then you will join us," she murmured, almost tenderly, as though he were a child heading toward an inevitable fall. The fog around him grew thicker, swallowing the bridge, the town, everything he knew. Shadows writhed within it, whispers creeping into his mind, distorting his thoughts. Each step felt like he was sinking deeper, as though the bridge was pulling him into another world entirely. Just as he thought he'd disappear into the mist, the woman reached out, her icy fingers grazing his cheek. Her touch sent a jolt through him, and a wave of memories, fragments of lives he didn't recognize, flooded his mind. Images of other people crossing the bridge, their faces twisted in fear, their voices swallowed by the darkness, flashed before his eyes. "Do you see now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chorus of voices echoing in his mind. "This bridge is a door, a passage. Once you cross, you can never truly return." And with that, she began to fade, her form dissipating into the fog as though she had never been there. Patrick was left alone on the bridge, the weight of her words pressing down on him, filling him with a hollow sense of dread. He was now part of the bridge's legacy, a secret that would forever haunt the town of Stillwater. But as he looked back, he saw something strange. The lights from the town were gone, replaced by an endless stretch of mist and shadows. He was no longer just at the edge of Stillwater, he was somewhere far darker, a place where the boundary between life and death was thin, where secrets waited to be uncovered. If he dared to look.
The fog clung to him like a shroud, thick and unforgiving, suffocating the last traces of normalcy from his mind. Patrick turned slowly, trying to orient himself, but the bridge behind him had vanished. There was nothing but mist and silence, as if he'd been plucked from the world he knew and dropped into a liminal space where time and reality held no power. He wasn't alone, though. He could feel it, an almost tangible sense of being watched, a prickling unease that crawled under his skin. The shadows in the fog were moving, shifting subtly, shapes that he couldn't quite make out but sensed in the corner of his vision. Then, like a whisper drifting through the silence, he heard it, footsteps, faint but deliberate, echoing through the void. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the fog. He could feel the dread pooling in his stomach, a sickening weight that made him want to run, even though he had nowhere to go. A low, familiar chuckle rose from the mist, chilling him to the core. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years, a voice he'd long thought lost. "You always were too curious for your own good, Patrick." The voice was rich with amusement, tinged with an edge of something darker. He froze, the blood draining from his face. "No. That's impossible." Slowly, the figure emerged from the fog, stepping into view with a smile that was both warm and chilling. It was his brother, Andrew, the one who'd gone missing years ago, the one everyone assumed had left town or met some dark fate. Patrick had spent years, searching for answers, haunted by the mystery of his brother's disappearance. And now, here he was, standing before him as if nothing had changed. "Andrew." His voice cracked, thick with disbelief. "How? How are you here?" Andrew's smile widened, but there was something wrong with it, something hollow. His eyes were darker than Patrick remembered, almost black, as though they'd absorbed the shadows around them. "There are things you don't understand, Patrick. This place. It's not what you think." "What do you mean?" Patrick took a hesitant step forward, but his brother's face twisted into a strange expression, part warning, part resignation. "This bridge. It takes you in, Patrick. It draws you in with promises, with secrets. You came here because you wanted to know the truth, didn't you?" Andrew's tone was almost mocking, but Patrick could hear the undercurrent of pain beneath it. "But some truths aren't meant for people like us." The fog around them began to shift again, and Patrick felt something cold wrap around his wrist, like fingers tightening their grip. He looked down, but nothing was there, just a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep into his veins, rooting him to the spot. "Andrew, I don't understand. What happened to you?" Patrick's voice shook, desperate for answers. He had thought that finding his brother would bring him closure, but now, standing in this misty nightmare, he felt only confusion and dread. His brother's face softened, the mocking edge fading as a hint of sorrow flickered in his dark eyes. "I crossed the bridge, just like you. I wanted to know what was out here, to uncover the truth. But once you cross, you're part of it forever. It's a trap, Patrick. A trap for those who are foolish enough to seek it." Patrick shook his head, unwilling to believe it. "No. There has to be a way out. You can come back with me. We can leave this place, together." Andrew laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Leave? You don't understand, do you? There is no going back. This place." He gestured to the fog and shadows that seemed to pulse around them. "It changes you. Warps you. And once you've given yourself to it, there's no escape." Patrick felt a surge of desperation. "I didn't give myself to anything. I just wanted answers. I wanted to know what happened to you." Andrew's gaze softened. "And now you know. I became part of this endless place. And now, so will you." As he spoke, Patrick felt an unsettling pull in his chest, as though something within him was unraveling, loosening from his body. Shadows swirled around him, whispering secrets he couldn't quite understand, words in languages he'd never heard. He felt like he was sinking, being drawn deeper into the bridge's dark underbelly, his sense of self fraying with each passing second. "Fight it, Patrick," Andrew whispered, his voice breaking for the first time. "If you can hold on to yourself, maybe you can still escape. But you have to fight, no matter how hard it gets." With a final look of sorrow, Andrew began to fade back into the mist, his form dissolving like smoke. Patrick reached out, desperate to hold on to him, but his fingers closed around nothing but air. The fog thickened, closing in, and he was alone again, lost in the endless expanse of shadows. He wanted to scream, to call out for his brother, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The bridge's whispers grew louder, filling his mind with fragmented thoughts, memories that weren't his own. He saw faces, countless faces, each one etched with terror, mouths open in silent screams. He felt their pain, their regret, their despair, and he knew he was becoming one of them. "Hold on," he whispered to himself, clinging to his brother's final words. But it was getting harder to remember who he was, harder to remember why he was here. The bridge was consuming him, piece by piece, until he was nothing more than another lost soul trapped in its endless embrace. As the last remnants of himself began to fade, he heard one final whisper, a voice that seemed to come from deep within the fog, distant and echoing. "Run." And with that single word, a surge of clarity cut through the darkness. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Patrick turned and ran, pushing through the fog, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He didn't know where he was going or if he could ever truly escape, but he ran, fueled by the faintest hope that maybe, just maybe, he could break free from the bridge's grasp. Patrick stumbled through the fog, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as he forced his legs to keep moving. The shadows around him seemed to writhe and pulse, reaching out like tendrils, as if they were alive, as if they sensed his fear and desperation. He could still feel the icy grip that had wrapped around his wrist, the phantom touch of his brother's hand urging him forward, pushing him to escape the bridge's dark hold. But as he ran, the fog thickened, turning the world into an impenetrable wall of grey. His mind began to waver, fragments of memories breaking apart, slipping from his grasp. He remembered Marla, her warning, her look of fear when he'd mentioned the bridge. He clung to the thought of her, letting it ground him, a tether to reality that kept him from slipping fully into the bridge's grasp. "Marla," he whispered, as though saying her name could banish the shadows. The fog thinned slightly, a small reprieve, and he pressed on, his footsteps echoing hollowly as he sprinted. The bridge seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and distorting, warping his perception. He couldn't tell how far he'd run or if he'd made any progress at all. It felt as though he were moving in circles, lost in a labyrinth that had no exit. And then, just as his hope began to wane, he saw a faint light ahead, a soft, warm glow that cut through the mist like a beacon. Relief surged through him, and he pushed himself harder, stumbling toward the light. As he drew closer, he realized it was the lamppost at the entrance of the bridge, the very spot where he had begun this nightmare journey. He burst through the fog and collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion. The mist receded, swirling back over the bridge as though it were retreating, as though the bridge itself were releasing him. For a brief, blissful moment, he felt a weight lift from his chest, a glimmer of hope that he had truly escaped. But as he lay there, catching his breath, a faint whisper drifted into his ear, a voice that sounded both familiar and foreign. "You think it's over, Patrick?" It was Andrew's voice, soft and distant, laced with a hint of laughter. "The bridge isn't done with you yet." Patrick bolted upright, his heart pounding as he scanned his surroundings. The bridge loomed behind him, silent and empty, but he could feel its presence, a dark force watching, waiting. He stood slowly, backing away, his eyes never leaving the mist that hung heavily over the bridge. A cold sweat trickled down his spine as Andrew's words echoed in his mind. He hurried back to town, his footsteps quick and unsteady, trying to shake the feeling that he was being followed. When he finally reached the edge of Stillwater, he expected to feel a sense of safety, a reassurance that he had left the bridge behind. But the town looked different. The streets were deserted, the houses shrouded in shadows, their windows dark and lifeless. A deep, unsettling silence hung over everything, and he felt as though he were walking through a ghost town. Marla. He called out, his voice echoing down the empty street. He hurried to her house, his mind racing, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, for any sign that he had truly returned. He knocked on her door, but there was no answer. The house was dark, as if it hadn't been lived in for years. "Marla, it's me, Patrick." His voice broke, panic clawing at him. He pounded on the door, hoping, praying that she would open it, that she would be there to reassure him that this was all real, that he had made it back. But there was only silence, an oppressive stillness that made his skin crawl. He turned away, his eyes scanning the empty street, and that's when he noticed something strange. Across the road, he saw figures, shadowy forms moving in the distance, just on the edge of his vision. They seemed to be watching him, their faces obscured, their bodies blending into the darkness. They didn't move closer, but he could feel their gaze, a silent judgment that chilled him to the bone. One of the figures stepped forward, and as the dim light from a street lamp illuminated his face, Patrick's heart dropped. It was Andrew, his expression blank, his eyes as dark as the fog that clung to the bridge. And beside him, he saw the woman from the bridge, her hollow gaze piercing through him, her face twisted in sorrow. Patrick stumbled back, feeling his world tilt as he realized the truth. He hadn't escaped. The bridge hadn't let him go. It had simply brought him here, to this twisted reflection of Stillwater, a place where lost souls roamed the streets, bound to the bridge's dark power. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This can't be." But as he looked around, he saw more faces, faces he recognized, people who had crossed the bridge before him, people who had vanished without a trace. They stared at him with empty eyes, their faces etched with sorrow, trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair. In the midst of them, he saw Marla, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, and he took a step forward, desperate to hold on to her, to pull her from this nightmare. But as his fingers brushed hers, he felt a jolt, a shock that sent him reeling back, as if an invisible force had repelled him. Marla's gaze filled with sorrow as she shook her head slowly. "You can't save me, Patrick. None of us can be saved." And in that moment, he understood. The bridge had claimed him, just as it had claimed them all. He was part of it now, bound to its darkness, forever walking the empty streets of this shadowed world, a prisoner of the bridge's secrets. As the fog rolled in around him, thick and heavy, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and Andrew's voice whispered in his ear, "Welcome home, brother. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out our channel for more stories."